everybody. Welcome to the Real Vibes. A little introduction of the Real Vibes before we get started. I'll be one of your hosts, one of the many hosts, and one of the many peoples featured on here, along with my co-host, brother KW, aka Jamaican Terror, aka Barbarians Are Us. I go by the name of Oxy18X. Some of you may know me. I'm a musician, 18X Records. But here I'm not Oxy 18X. I'm your professor, Po Life, Mishak Po, whoever you want to call me. And all this is for the people that are in this so-called truth, and for the people of the world. You're welcome to tag along into this. We're not gonna make up any of anything you're gonna hear. We're reading the book called True Vikings by Nasheed Al Amin. I believe this was released sometime in 2013. So we're about to start going into the context, but before that, I will let Brother KW say a couple things about himself before we go.
What's up? Hi, what's up, y'all? I'm KW. I'm KW as my co-host. As my co-host. So blissfully said in that introduction. I'm a bit of a history buff, and I'm just I, I'm just here to help anybody any way I can with any of this, anything in this knowledge or anything pertaining to history. So let's
Yes, sir.
so let's get it.
And a disclaimer, all of this is targeted towards the so-called black man, especially the young so-called black man. But like I said, everybody of the world is more than welcome to join in. So we're about to enter the context, and then we're about to read until we basically have things to do. So let's go. Opening page for context, forward. Europe, we are told, has always been the domain of white skinned people, classified variously as Caucasians, whites, Nordics, Aryans, Indo Europeans, white people. So when we read or hear of any particular people inhabiting Europe, we assume because of what practically all historians and scholars have impressed upon us for roughly 3 centuries, that the people under discussion were white or Caucasian, the Vikings or Norsemen, or one such group of people. Perhaps 98% of books written about them make the claim that they were white, blonde, blue-eyed Nordics, pardon me, often without offering a shred of proof. We all people assume this must be true. Eurocentric scholars, those who extol the ingenuity, civilization, uniqueness, and purity of all things European over all other races, have repeatedly asserted the physical appearance of Scandinavians today to validate this. So the same must have been so 1, 2, 3 millennia ago, which seems only reasonable since we also have been told that light or white skin is necessary in far northern regions of our planet. Black skinned people could never have survived in frigid conditions. Interesting. We go on. Not having a computer or access to the internet until fairly recently, the first two drafts of this work were done on an electric typewriter. After someone gave me a computer about 3 years ago. I did a third draft of the book as I typed it into my computer, chapter by chapter, except for an internet article. Third draft, I except for an internet article, third draft of the book as I typed it into my computer chapter by chapter, except for an internet article until, pardon me, brothers, internet article, until after this work was completed, finding that there were articles written on black Vikings and other European blacks.
Mhm.
This is getting a bit spicy. Some offering quotes from sources cited in the works you are about to read. These internet articles also post commentary from readers and some insisting that Vikings or Norsemen could not have been black because white skin was essential to survive frigid weather conditions of Northern Europe, and that only so called Nordics had ever inhabited Northern Europe is an assumption that has been drilled into us through the works of Eurocentric scholars and scientists. This book will demonstrate, however, that this assertion is flawed, perhaps a deliberately conceived fallacy devised to. This book will demonstrate to the reader that the Vikings, Norsemen, or Scandinavians, particularly non-Caucasian people, and that particularly those who of the so-called Viking age brackets Common Era 800 to Common Era 11, 1 and 100. So from the 9th century, brothers, to the 12th century, the Viking age, 9th century to the 12th century, really goes back all the way to the 8th century, were predominantly black and dark-skinned non-Caucasian people, and that blacks, whether of African or Asian descent, were not strangers to any part of Europe in ancient or historical times. Although the word race has been fairly debunked over the last 2 decades or more, the world has endured 3 or 4 centuries of racial conditioning, the effects of which still remaining embedded in our psyches and still affects the quality of life for millions of people around the earth within most of the world nations, large or small, there. Often ethnically divergent people suffering discrimination from the ruling class or the predominant race in their particular countries. Some recent or current examples of are the Uyghurs and the Tibetans suffering discrimination from the majority Han Chinese in China, Aborigines treated as second class citizens by the majority white population of Australia, Palestinians suffering the contempt of Israeli overlords, Gypsies persecuted and marginalized in Eastern Europe and many countries they reside, African immigrant populations in Italy and Spain suffering ostracism by the majority populations, Muslims discriminated against in France, the country having officially banned Muslim women from wearing headscarves in public and Muslim girls banned from wearing them in schools. Sudanese blacks being set upon, killed, and driven from their towns by Arab governments, force who are judging by what is seen on television nearly as black skinned as the blacks they are persecuting. The above are only the most commonly heard incidences of oppression, persecution, and in the case of the ongoing Israeli Palestinian conflict, protracted genocide. Though many lesser many lesser known but similar situations can be cited, like the passage of a recent Arizona law authorizing the police to question anyone they feel is an illegal alien aimed primarily at Mexicans. The killing in Sri Lanka of untold thousands of ethnic Tamils, which has elicited charges of genocide from major rights groups and which the United Nations is considering looking into. A greater and more enduring form of oppression is that waged against practically every nation of of a greater and more enduring form every nation of the world with predominantly black and dark skinned populations by the Western powers of Europe and the United States, which has been in evidence for roughly 500 years, but whose origins date back at least 2 millennia to about the time of the rise of Rome, which I term which I term in New Rome to be discussed later, which sought to conquer the known world. Generally speaking, there are no indications that race or racism played any part in the Roman quest for world domination, that race or racism played any part in the many wars that took place in the archaic world which preceded the advent of Rome. At least the chroniclers of those days and times made no allusion to race per se, and did not denigrate enemies or nations in racist tinged commentary. Nevertheless, the seeds of racism we know today of supposed white superiority and the inferiority of the dark skinned races are noticed and unremarked upon by the Eurocentric chroniclers is an ongoing plague loosed upon the world when white European nations finally overcame the domination of an older dark skinned world which had held them in check almost until the onset of the 16th century. Mm-mm-mm. A world which Norsemen or Vikings were a significant factor in during the Viking Age, roughly spanning the years 800 to 1100 AD. Like I said, brothers, ninth century AD to 12th century AD. Really starting back all the way back to around the late century, the late 700s. The unleashed of European or white racism, rapine and slaughter would directly and negatively impact the indigenous populations of the Americas, Africa, Southern Asia, and eventually Australia, China, and the island nations of the South Pacific. The effects of racism, which has affected practically the entire planet, still haunt us today and affecting international relations and influencing the way we regard fellow human beings within nations or in other areas of the world. It is this European white versus black, superior versus inferior brand of racism which will be discussed now and again throughout this web. We know what we know of history, what we have been taught, what has been presented to us, impressed upon us, embedded into our consciousness through repetition and visual imagery, fortified by the assumed infallibility of the Eurocentric intellectual and scientific authorities that present us with information. And for the past 2 centuries or more, Eurocentric Western scholarship has dominated our view of what we know of history, from the Americas to India and in all the areas of the world colonized by European nations. Although the standing armies which once subjugated these various nations are gone, legacies of legacies of European colonialism yet remain: the Christian religion, the European languages spoken by the populaces of non-European nations, the necessity of the vast majority of the populaces to speak those European languages: English in Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and India, French in Haiti, Senegal, Niger, Niger, Spanish throughout South and Central America. Since the educational systems of those nations are chiefly based on what the colonizers established, and which in some cases the former colonial powers still administer, so the education received by the populaces is unavoidably westernized, be it literature, physics, psychology, or most of our important understanding history, and most important for our understanding history. The history was most of the world whose most of the world has inculcated is a Eurocentric vision, which most of us have come to accept as truthful, absolute. In most instances, none of these adjectives can or should be applied to what Eurocentric writers have presented to us regarding the history of the world from the most ancient past to the present. While the main focus of this work is the Vikings or Norsemen, I find it necessary to begin with an overview of man's beginning and the peopling of the earth. Though I adhere to the conventional time framers for the most part, I do feel the most. I do feel that man has been roaming the earth for far longer than Eurocentric scholars and historians admit, and that the ancient Egypt is more ancient than we have been led to believe. Here, here and there, I break with convention and pursue a course the reader may not at all have considered before, but I will not do this without valid justification. Even the experts are not always in agreement on particular points, like the old age of the Great Pyramid or the Great Sphinx. Pardon me. The years, particularly Egyptian dynasties, began and ended whether the Trojan War actually occurred or was it totally mythological. Whether modern man mated with Neanderthals. My own study of history has led me to certain conclusions that may not be in accord with standard views, and I ask the reader to contemplate what I have to say. In all instances, employ his or her own common sense and logic. My master's degree is in English, not history or anthropology. I have been an adjunct English professor for 27 years, teaching essay and research writing as well as literature. However, I began a personal study of history more than 40 years ago after reading J.A. Rogers' Sex and Race, Volume 1. You know, this is a promo to that book, brothers. If you don't have J.A. Rogers' Sex and Race, Volume 1, please get you that so you know that none of this stuff is made up and people are not making this up. That book is, I believe, as old as Israel, the state. I sought out books of an African history, anthropology, Native Americans, and race, building my own modest library. and pursuing my own areas of study. I also pursued an acting career, got married, wrote poetry, and began a novel before entering college at age 30, where I eventually decided that I wanted to teach college level English. But I continued to read historical material absent any historical discipline or approach as I might have had to do had I formerly pursued a degree in history or anthropology. While I consider myself a minor historian, the reader might consider me a mere researcher or historical neophyte. I have read the works of a number of historians, some prominent, some less so, all of whom I consider more conversant and informed than myself. Although I may not totally agree with their theories and conclusion, I have never examined ancient artifacts firsthand, gone on archaeological digs, or visited most of the areas I discussed in this book. I can only trust in the research, theories, and writings of those who have devoted much of their lives to the subject they discourse upon, contrast their conclusions with others presenting theories regarding the same subject. Consider, contemplate, and weigh what I have read, then add, subtract, and reorder impressions and visions in my mind. I synthesize the material and arrive to my own concepts, beliefs, and conclusions about the subject in question. My opinions are formulated according to what seems most reasonable, most accurate, and most probable. Just as any other writer or researcher of history, I utilize the sources that best allow me to achieve my objectives and validate my assertions. Some readers, of course, might not open themselves to what I present and stubbornly cling to the outline of history they are most comfortable and familiar with, an outline per- practically devoid of any contribution by black skinned participants in world history. And in any notion, the cherished Vikings were not blonde, blue eyed Aryans will strike them as outlandish. Ain't that right? Impotent or abhorrent. European writers, Eurocentric writers, including white American writers, have elevated the Vikings into demigods, just as they have ancient Greek, Romans, and Germans, popes, and almost any notable individual or people who appeared on the European continent. Doing so lends credence to the assumption of superiority that most whites seem to feel and often exhibit toward the darker races of mankind. Their historians have repeatedly told them that they gave civilization to the world. Most false fallacy in the world. Like, it's crazy. Shaped and ordered it and spread it, spawned the inventions and sciences, arts, and explorations that improved human conditions. Maybe in the trailer park, right, brother? One practice Eurocentric historians have used to practically write black skinned people out of history is to subsume the ancient Egyptians, Sumerians, Indians, and none other Caucasian peoples into the Caucasian race, thereby transforming the innovation, civilizations, architecture, and achievements of the people into the works of the Caucasians, whites, by associations, peoples we know today as Europeans. Look at what they do. Look at what they go and do. I am a Vietnam era veteran, but thankfully I did not serve in Vietnam. I spent almost 2.5 years of my 3 years USA Army service in Europe, almost 2 years in France, my last 7 months in Germany, spending time in or passing through five other countries, Luxembourg, Belgium, Italy, and Switzerland, using up at least using up the last of my leave time before returning to the States, I spent 2 months in Copenhagen, Denmark. This now distant period represents the bulk of my travel anywhere, and although I did not know what I know now about the history of Scandinavia and the Vikings, two realizations remained with me as I rode the train back to my post in Germany. All Danes were not blonde haired, maybe 40% of those I saw in Copenhagen. And speaking here as an African American, the Danes were the friendliest Europeans I had encountered. I remember asking myself again and again on the train ride back to my post, why are they so friendly? Wake up, black man. Denmark is North Germany, where 80 or so years ago Hitler extolled the superiority of the blonde Aryan. There is a much smaller percentage of blondes in Germany than in Denmark. So when I visited Copenhagen 22 years after the end of World War II, I did not expect to be openly welcomed by what I imagined to be the super Aryan Danes, who were surely purer whites than the Germans, but no. Though Europeans generally showed more respect and acceptance toward me than American whites ever had, I remember the Danes as the most friendly and urbane of Europeans. I mentioned my sojourn in Copenhagen only to inform the reader that I did spend time in a Scandinavian land, so the broad coast of Sweden, only a few miles away from across a strait separating Zealand, the island upon which Copenhagen is situated, from Sweden, called the Sound, and experienced the sun coming up before 2 a.m. after only about 4 hours of darkness. I believe the average reader will find that what I represent, revelatory, I utilize reputable sources, some historians long forgotten or deliberately overlooked by modern writers of Viking history. Most of the sources I utilize are not difficult to find, and a number of Icelandic sagas easily accessible in libraries or bookstores provide information on a number of Norsemen who are described as black, dark, or ruddy complexioned. Although black Vikings or black Norsemen are not the focus of this work, I find it is necessary to begin the journey from the remote times to show that black skinned people are not strangers to the western extremity of Asia, and that they, as black Egyptians and other Africans and black skinned Asians, called Europe home even into fairly recent historical times, as we will be seeing. This book is intended as a comprehensive work presenting detailed information about Viking weaponry, religion, dress, costumes, shipbuilding techniques, successions of rulers, and so forth. The reader can consult many Viking books in libraries or lining the shelves in the bookstores for these particulars. A number of those areas will be touched upon, of course, but the primary focus of this work is the racial makeups of the people called the Norsemen. An issue, the more popular and accessible books do not honestly delineate the or even mention, invariably asserting that these northern warriors were blonde, blue-eyed Caucasians of the Nordic race. Evidence will be presented demonstrating that the Norsemen of Scandinavia were predominantly black-skinned, the so-called during the so-called Dark Ages, Viking Age, and into the Middle Ages. were often referred to as black pagans, black heathens, black devils, and Moors in the British Isles. This fact is almost never mentioned in popular books on Vikings, and the few sources which do mention the blackness of the Vikings do so fleetingly on a page or two and almost never afterward. When the adjective black is used to describe the racial makeup of a member or members of the human family, most people equate it to a black or sub-Saharan African. Not everybody's from Africa, brothers. Wake up. With Negroid features, my use of the term black will include such people will also imply people with black skin outside of Africa who may not exhibit the typical African features that we are familiar with. People from south of India, Myanmar, Burma, Bangladesh, Indonesia, or the dark-skinned people in the areas of the Near East and the Arabian Peninsula. My use of the term black or dark skinned should not be confused with Caucasians, people with white or colorless skin, long wavy hair, less predominant cheekbones, a segment of whom may be blonde and have blue, gray, or green eyes, along with Africa, Asia, itself and once a dark continent with black and much dark-skinned populations than it exhibits today. As will be discussed, it is not my intent at all to disrespect people of the above listed areas of the world who do not think of themselves in terms of color or race, or people who may think themselves as Caucasians because they embrace the classifications of Eurocentric writers who have classified them as such. Irregardless, we live in a world that generally abides by what Europeans have outlined, defined, and classified, while today's trend is to debunk racial theories or declare that there is no such reality as race. We can not easily undo the 4 to 5 centuries of racial conditioning which most of humanity has been impelled to in, inculcate. I'd say about 3 plus centuries of that nonsense. This work must be necessarily this work must necessarily be written in racial vein. We have come to understand to that we can also understand how Eurocentric historians, scientists have used race and racial classifications to the advantage, especially in declaring that this people or that Caucasian, ancient Egyptians, Indians, Australians, Aborigines, Norsemen, and many others to glorify white Europeans and diminish the achievement of black and dark skinned humanity. Since almost any encyclopedia will inform the reader that the Vikings and Norsemen arrived on the North American shores roughly 500 years before Christopher Columbus dropped an anchor in the Bahamas, there must be a tangible reason for the Western world to select him over the Vikings as the discoverer of America. That reason may be a simple one: racism. Perhaps the Eurocentric brotherhood of academia long ago realized that a little too much information was extant regarding black Norsemen to accord them this achievement. Not that the Norsemen were the actual first visitors to the American terrain. They went outside of an early Native Americans who considered the first must be considered the first. There is evidence that the black African, Chinese, Egyptian, Phoenician, Carthaginian, and Irish visitors came to areas of North America prior to the Vikings. some of whom will be touched upon in the would be touched upon on this work. Some more than others, also discussed in adequate details, will be the origins of Black Vikings, the expansion and influence in Europe, names of Norse individuals which indicate their probable racial makeup, Thorstein the Black, and other the Blacks, and individuals whose names do not know complexion but who are described as black skinned in the Icelandic saga. Thorhall the Hunter or Huntsman, who was chief navigator for Eric the Red, the man who basically went to Canada. Oh, or maybe that was his son. I think it was his son. Red, more than likely an indicator of a dark or brown complexion, hey, perhaps resulting from mixed parentage. Eagle Skallagrimson, and other Viking explorers, warriors, and chieftains. I know they like that, K-Dub. Skallagrimson. They like my Scandinavian. While the notion of the Black Vikings or Norsemen might surprise or offend the reader who has never heard of or imagined blacks even inhabiting Europe, much less Scandinavia, evidence does exist showing this was so, and that the Norsemen of the Viking Age were styled black by presumably white populaces of areas they overran, particularly those of Ireland, Wales, and what will become England, where learning and literacy had not totally succumbed to the atrophy of the Dark Ages in Europe. 500, so 6th century to the 12th century Common Era, which is what they consider the Dark Ages. Sources mentioning Black Vikings are not abundant, nor are sources mentioning other black and dark skinned peoples who made their home in Europe. Works by more modern all popular historians most often totally ignore all the works by reputable authors who did not attempt to portray Europe as an eternal Caucasian homeland. I utilized several of these older sources in this work, as well as more modern ones, which I think that I have explored every source available. I have not spent hours in dimly lighted research libraries poring over archival materials, and as mentioned, I did not research the internet writing this book the old-fashioned way, typing the first two drafts on an electrical typewriter. So I am certain there are beneficial sources that I have missed because writing essentially part time, teaching and correcting papers, and working non teaching part time jobs to make ends meet. I simply did not have time for extensive research. But what becomes apparent to the reader is that even the pursual of more accessible works have, however, briefly offered spoonfuls of evidence that black and dark-skinned peoples have participated in the affairs of Europe despite efforts by what I call Eurocentric Brotherhood academia. Might have to use that one, man. Will you by what I call the Eurocentric Brotherhood of Academia to obscure this reality, presenting an intelligible narrative of European history is an extremely difficult undertaking. Eurocentric Europeans have littered their works with a multitude of tribes and peoples, some major, some not, immigrating, settling among, displacing and contending with numbers of other tribes and peoples with assorted nomenclatures, some presumed to be racially, culturally, and phenotypically different, but invariably white. A scan of a historical atlas of Europe during eight of the height of the Roman Empire, the dark ages of the ninth century will bear this out. Or look at the number of people occupying ancient Greece in the fifth century ages or the ninth century will bear this out. Outlook. All the ancient peoples occupying Greece, fifth century Britain, and 10th century Germany in historical atlases. Consider also that Europe is a mere extension of Asia. Mm-mm-mm. And that the whole Western Europe, the tourism mecca with with its Alps, numerous countries, expansive Riviera and world famous cities, is essentially no larger than the Arabian Peninsula. Mm-mm-mm. Even tossing in the British Isles, writers of European history present nearly all the tribes as distinct, some emigrating from points farther east from Asia itself, nudging themselves into the West Asian extremity, supposedly already occupied by Caucasian, yet Eurocentric historians, anthropologists, writers, educators, and filmmakers would have would have us believe that all the people and tribes who made their home in and emigrated into Europe were and have always been white or Caucasian. The term German-born Johann Blumenbach first coined in the early 19th century to describe people of European or supposed white ancestry. Our journey must necessarily begin with an overview of men spread around most of the earth after leaving Africa, allegedly, with statements from respected historians attesting to his negritude. We will look at the possible origins of white people or Caucasians and their spread into Europe. I dispense with biblical references. That's very important, brothers. The Bible is a historical, geographical, archaeological book of prophecy, as some scholars have employed to outline the differentiation and dispersion of major racial groups of people, relying instead on historical anthropological data. In most instances will discuss the ancient black populations of Asia and then steadily begin to focus on Europe and the ancient intermingling of people there moving into historical times. Half dozen middle chapters concentrate on black Vikings or Norsemen and include a listing of individuals whose names denote blackness or are described as black or dark skinned in early chronicles and the Icelandic sagas, a chapter who are described as black or dark skinned. Pardon me, a chapter on Columbus and Europeans to the Americas, and two chapters discussing DNA science will follow, and then we will try to make sense of what we have discussed and see how the European we know today gained the ascendancy it maintains with the assistance of the United States. and what that ascendancy has wrought upon the rest of the world. I must add, when I began my research into the Vikings, I did so believing they were blonde, blue-eyed Nordics. I had always heard they were. It was 1991, and the build-up for the quincentenary of Columbus arriving in in America had begun. Why, I asked myself, for the hundredth time, aren't the Vikings credited with America's discovery? I wrote a 20-page research paper that did not answer the question. It it was when I wrote the second draft coming across modern source asserting that the Vikings were black that I found focus expanding my research to 65 pages. A couple of years later, I felt I had enough information to begin a book whose purpose now is to demonstrate that the Vikings of the Dark and Middle Ages were predominantly black and dark-skinned peoples, not blonde-haired Caucasians or more modern historians have long claimed. Have long claimed they were. Whether Norsemen ever wrote their own histories or chronicled particular events, invasions, expeditions, or religious practices is regrettably unknown. Or else, from us, most of what we know of them is derived from Scandinavia or Icelandic poems and tales recorded 2 or 3 centuries after the individuals and the events they were involved in took place. Most revealing, though, are chronicles recorded by Irish, English, and Welsh historians. I have not pursued French, Italians, and other European sources which may be in existence. Writing during or nearer to the times under the discussion offering a more visceral depiction of Vikings and the fear they evoked in British populaces. These are often tinged with prejudice and deliberate distortions in regard to the race. However, distortion cannot be blamed for descriptions referring to Viking Norsemen as black heathen, black stranger, or black devils. Historians, the most of black devils in the chronicles of the period written by men who were presumably white. We will also see some later historians, those most ignored by more modern writers, called other tribes of Europeans or Asians who entered Europe black, including tribes generally classified as Germanic, as well as peoples who were part of classical Greece. To repeat, Eurocentric and scientists historians and scientists have littered history with dozens of tribes spouting out of nowhere, seemingly dissimilar in character and appearance and culture, yet Caucasian or so we would surmise, since concerning Europe, a little effort has been made by historians to describe these peoples in racial terms. Although Europeans were the originators of racial division and theories, rather Eurocentric historians and scientists, I always include white Americans in the term Eurocentric, more often employ non-racial terminologies to obscure the achievement of darker peoples or diminish black and dark-skinned peoples from history itself. These were the earliest human beings to spread around the earth and establish the world's earliest civilizations, which Europeans borrowed from to begin their own. In this in this work, the term black refers to people with significant melanin content given to their skin. A black or brown person, irrespective of their hair texture, physiognomy, body type, skull shape, nose, eyes, eye color. For what reason? Eurocentric scientists have long classified black and brown skinned Indians from India and black Australian Aborigines as Caucasians. I consider these people on the whole quite black, as well as ancient peoples of North Africa near the East and Central and Southern Asia, the Island Nations of the Pacific, a relatively recent book, The History of and Geography of Human Genes by several DNA scientists, continues the Eurocentric practices of submitting black and dark skinned peoples into the Caucasian family, which will be discussed in two later chapters. I do not claim to have all the answers to every topic raised in this work, while I demonstrate that some of the hodgepodge of the peoples on historical atlases were black and dark skinned, like the Goths. Hey, brothers, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm an African man before we go back right in there, but as an African man, I always found it strange that every time I've done the research on my father's last name, it always came up related to the Visigoths, who are Gothic Germanic people. But we go back to the book. Like the Goths, who are always styled Germans for their lack of clear information, I have not done this with all the European groups mentioned. I make every effort to combine my assertions with the statements of historians and scholars who have done far more research in various areas than I have. Even those I may generally disagree with, I do not think the reader will see a much different picture and a more honest one of Europe than the picture Eurocentric historians have presented over the last 3 centuries or so, allowing us to understand that the theory of so called racial purity is transitory, deceptive, and illusory for the most part, although for many of us, theory is most associated with the era of Hitler and Nazism. Racial purity and emotions it evokes has been long ingrained in white European psyche and remains rampant in the psyche of white Americans today. The sooner we dispense with the notion of racial purity, the byproduct of which is the racial superiority most Caucasians have long felt towards blacks, people of color in general, and better human family. Yeah, okay, dog.
Yeah, no,